In late 2000, a Microsoft executive sat down and wrote a memo to Steve Ballmer, laying out a plan in language specific enough that it would later end up as evidence in a federal antitrust trial. The plan, in his own words, "I'm thinking of hitting the OEM harder than in the past with anti-Linux actions." He continued, describing how Microsoft would further try to restrict source code deliveries where possible and be less gracious when interpreting agreements, again without being obvious about it. And then, almost as an aside, he added one more line that captures the entire spirit of what he was proposing. "This will be a delicate dance." That's not a fictionalized dramatization. That's a direct quote, pulled from a genuine internal Microsoft memo that later surfaced as evidence in the company's landmark antitrust proceedings, one of the most consequential legal battles in the history of the technology industry. The man who wrote that memo died this past February at the age of 84, largely unknown outside a narrow circle of antitrust lawyers, tech journalists, and people who lived through the Microsoft trial of the late 1990s. His name was Joachim Kempen. For 15 years, he ran Microsoft's entire OEM division, the part of the company responsible for licensing Windows to every major PC manufacturer on Earth. And according to court documents, his own internal memos, and multiple contemporary news reports, Kempen ran one of the most aggressive, most consequential anti-Linux campaigns in the history of the personal computer industry, largely out of public view, while Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer became the public faces of Microsoft's rivalry with open source. Let's actually meet the man behind that memo, because his story is a genuinely underexplored piece of exactly the history this channel covers regularly. And understanding what he actually did tells you something real about how Microsoft's war against Linux was fought well beyond the more famous public statements everyone already knows. Kempen's path to Microsoft started a long way from Redmond. Born in Germany in 1942, he joined a Digital Equipment Corporation in Munich back in 1972, initially working as an instructor, teaching computer programming classes to DEC's customers. He worked his way up through DEC's training division, eventually relocating to the company's headquarters in Bedford, Massachusetts. After a brief stop at National Semiconductor and a stint with Apple's team in Paris as a European marketing manager, Kempen eventually joined a still small software company called Microsoft, initially taking a general manager position running its newly formed German subsidiary. It's worth noting how genuinely varied that early career path actually was, since it doesn't fit the more familiar template of a lifelong Microsoft insider who rose entirely within one company's culture. Kempen had already spent roughly a decade and a half working across DEC, National Semiconductor, and Apple, three genuinely different companies with three genuinely different corporate cultures, before ever setting foot inside Microsoft. That breadth of experience across competing companies in the broader computing industry likely shaped the specific, unsentimental, deeply pragmatic approach to competitive strategy he later became known for. Once he reached a position of real influence. From there, Kempen's rise inside Microsoft was rapid. He moved into the division dealing directly with PC manufacturers, the OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers, who build and sell the actual physical computers that Windows runs on. By 1990, he'd been promoted to Senior Vice President, a position that put him at the absolute center of one of the most consequential relationships in the entire personal computer industry. The relationship between Microsoft, the company controlling the dominant operating system, and the hardware manufacturers who needed that operating system to sell their machines at all. It's worth understanding exactly how much leverage that specific position actually gave Kempen, because it explains why journalists at the time started calling him things like Microsoft's secret power broker, and, more pointedly, Bill Gates' enforcer. Kempen had final sign-off on every single Microsoft licensing contract with every major hardware maker in the world, Compaq, Dell, Germany's Vobis, and virtually everyone else building PCs at scale. He determined which Microsoft products got preloaded on which systems coming off assembly lines around the world. And critically, he controlled pricing, how much each individual hardware vendor actually paid Microsoft per machine for the right to include Windows. In an industry where virtually every PC needed Windows to be commercially viable, controlling that pricing lever meant controlling an enormous amount of leverage over an entire industry's profit margins, all from a position most ordinary computer users had never heard of. To put that leverage in concrete terms, a hardware manufacturer's entire business, at that point in computing history, depended almost completely on being able to sell machines running Windows, since the overwhelming majority of consumers and businesses simply wouldn't consider buying a PC that couldn't run the software they already used. That gave Microsoft, and specifically the executive controlling licensing terms and pricing, something close to veto power over any individual manufacturer's profitability. A slightly less favorable per unit price, applied across millions of units sold annually, could mean the difference between a healthy profit margin and a genuinely difficult year for a major PC manufacturer. Kempen held exactly that lever for every major manufacturer, simultaneously for the better part of a decade and a half, which is exactly the kind of concentrated, largely invisible structural power that later became central to the government's antitrust case against Microsoft. A contemporary 1998 profile asking, "Who is Microsoft's secret power broker?" captured the dynamic precisely. When Microsoft needed to actually get hardware vendors to comply with its wishes, it wasn't Bill Gates working the phones. It wasn't Microsoft's senior vice president of law. It was Kempen directly calling manufacturers, using his control over licensing and pricing to enforce Microsoft's preferred behavior across the entire PC industry. One contemporary account specifically credited Kempen with ensuring that the price of Windows actually rose during a period when the underlying price of PCs themselves was falling. A genuinely striking economic detail, since it meant Microsoft's own licensing revenue kept growing, even as the hardware surrounding it became steadily cheaper and more commoditized, a dynamic that doesn't happen by accident in a genuinely competitive market. Now let's actually get into the specific tactics, because this is where Kempen's story moves from powerful licensing executive into the person Bill Gates called his enforcer, and where his connection to the anti-Linux campaign becomes concrete rather than abstract. The most famous piece of evidence here is the memo we opened this video with, but it's worth understanding the full context around it, because the timing makes it considerably more significant than a single quote taken in isolation. Kempen wrote that specific memo describing his plan to hit OEMs harder than in the past with anti-Linux actions in late 2000, which was, critically, after Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson had already ruled that Microsoft had unlawfully maintained its monopoly and had ordered the company broken into two separate parts. In other words, Kempen was describing an escalated anti-Linux campaign at almost the exact moment Microsoft was under direct, active federal court scrutiny, specifically for anti-competitive behavior toward, among other things, its OEM partners. That's a genuinely remarkable detail worth sitting with directly. A company that had just been found guilty in federal court of illegally maintaining its monopoly and had just been ordered broken up as a consequence, had an executive at the same time actively planning to escalate the exact category of behavior that had led to that ruling in the first place, and doing so with explicit language about avoiding obviousness, suggesting a level of awareness that the conduct itself was legally risky, rather than any confusion about whether it crossed a line. That timing is exactly why this specific memo became such powerful evidence when it surfaced during the subsequent state's remedy hearing in Washington, D.C. A state's attorney named Stephen Cooney specifically produced Kempen's memo in court, and reporting from the time described it as devastating evidence, not because the language was unusually crude for a business memo, but because it demonstrated a company continuing, and even planning to escalate, exactly the kind of behavior a federal court had just ruled illegal, seemingly without much concern about being caught doing it again. The specific target of that particular memo was Dell. Michael Dell had, a few years earlier, publicly and enthusiastically declared his interest in Linux, and Dell had made real strategic investments in Linux-focused companies, including Easel and Red Hat. That public enthusiasm didn't last. According to subsequent reporting, Dell quietly pulled Linux from its desktop PC lineup in the summer of 2001, roughly 6 months after that public declaration of interest. And it later emerged that Kempen had specifically promised Ballmer he would be putting the screws on PC builders, using almost exactly that phrase, to make exactly this kind of retreat happen across the industry more broadly. It's worth tracing that Dell timeline a little more closely, because the speed of the reversal is itself telling. Michael Dell's public, enthusiastic embrace of Linux, complete with real financial investment in Linux-focused companies, represented a genuine strategic bet on open source, gaining real traction in the desktop and server markets. The reversal, happening within about 6 months, quietly, without any public announcement explaining the change of heart, is exactly the pattern you'd expect if a company had faced significant behind-the-scenes commercial pressure specifically designed to be difficult to trace back to its actual source. Journalists covering the story years later, once Kempen's memos surfaced, specifically connected these two events directly, describing Dell's abandonment of desktop Linux as a consequence of exactly the pressure campaign Kempen had promised Ballmer he would run. It's worth being precise about the actual mechanism Kempen used here, because pressuring OEMs can sound vague without understanding the specific economic lever involved. Microsoft's position, according to internal memos surfacing during the trial, was that OEMs should be allowed to meet demand but not help create demand for Linux machines, meaning hardware vendors weren't necessarily banned outright from selling any Linux-based PCs whatsoever, but were pressured not to actively promote, market, or make Linux options easy and visible for ordinary customers to actually choose. Given Kempen's direct control over Windows licensing pricing and terms, an OEM that pushed too hard on Linux risked losing favorable pricing or facing what Kempen himself described as being less gracious when interpreting agreements, a deliberately vague, plausibly deniable phrase covering a wide range of ways Microsoft could make life more difficult for a manufacturer that didn't fall in line, all while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid an obvious, easily provable smoking gun. That meet demand but not create demand framing is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's a genuinely clever piece of corporate language, designed to walk right up to the edge of an outright ban without technically crossing it. An OEM operating under that instruction could still, in theory, sell a Linux machine to a customer who specifically walked in and asked for one. What they couldn't do was feature it prominently, market it actively, or make it an easy, visible default adjacent choice the way Windows machines were positioned. That's a meaningfully different and considerably harder to prove in court form of restriction than a simple direct ban, which is precisely why it took Kempen's own internal memos, rather than any observable public policy, to actually demonstrate that this restriction existed at all. That's exactly what Kempen meant by, "This will be a delicate dance." The goal wasn't a blunt, easily documented ban that would obviously violate the antitrust ruling Microsoft was already facing. It was a subtler, harder-to-prove campaign of pricing pressure and selective enforcement, calibrated specifically to discourage Linux adoption among OEMs without creating an obvious paper trail. Though, as it turned out, Kempen's own memos ended up being exactly that paper trail once they surfaced in court. Kempen's fingerprints show up across multiple other pieces of Microsoft's antitrust history, too, beyond just this specific anti-Linux campaign. During his deposition in October 1998, taken as part of the original DOJ antitrust case, Kempen acknowledged under oath that Microsoft required OEMs to agree to license Internet Explorer as a condition of licensing. Windows 95, precisely the kind of product tying arrangement that formed one of the central legal theories in the government's entire case against Microsoft. That deposition became significant enough that it was later used as required reading in university courses studying the Microsoft antitrust case, specifically as a model of how prosecutors gather evidence in a complex corporate case. Princeton's own antitrust seminar assigned specific excerpts of Kempen's deposition testimony as coursework, alongside a discussion question asking students to evaluate whether the government's questioning actually achieved its objectives. It's worth appreciating just how significant it is for a deposition to end up as assigned university coursework decades later, since that's a genuinely unusual afterlife for a piece of corporate legal testimony. Most depositions and most corporate lawsuits disappear into case files, read only by the lawyers directly involved and perhaps a handful of specialist researchers. Kempen's specific testimony being singled out years later as a teaching tool for how skilled questioning can extract genuinely consequential admissions from a reluctant corporate witness speaks to just how central his role and his own words ended up being to the broader historical record of this entire case. It's also worth understanding that Kempen's aggressive tactics weren't limited to Linux specifically. Internal memos from Bill Gates himself, addressed directly to Kempen with copies sent to Ballmer and other senior Microsoft executives, discuss strategies to undermine Java momentum, referring to Sun Microsystem's competing programming platform, which Microsoft viewed as a separate but related threat to its platform dominance during roughly the same period. Kempen's OEM division, in other words, functioned as a kind of enforcement arm across multiple simultaneous competitive threats Microsoft was navigating at the time, not solely focused on open source. That broader pattern is worth noting specifically because it suggests Kempen's anti-Linux campaign wasn't an isolated one-off initiative he personally championed. It was one application of a broader institutional playbook. Microsoft's senior leadership was actively directing him to run against multiple competitive threats simultaneously, with Gates himself directly involved in setting strategy at a level specific enough to name individual competitors and desired outcomes. Given all of this, it's genuinely not surprising that a contemporary profile specifically described Kempen as the Microsoft executive, around whom swirls most of the current Microsoft versus DOJ fireworks, a remarkable statement given how many other far more publicly recognizable Microsoft executives, including Gates and Ballmer themselves, were simultaneously embroiled in the exact same litigation. One retrospective summary of Kempen's career put it even more directly. He did more than just about any Microsoft executive, with the possible exception of Gates himself, to get Microsoft hauled into federal antitrust court in the first place. That's a genuinely striking claim to sit with, since it places Kempen, a name most people, even people reasonably well-versed in tech history, have likely never encountered, above nearly every other Microsoft executive in terms of actual contribution to the legal jeopardy the company faced during this period. Gates and Ballmer became the public faces of that trial because they were the CEO and eventual CEO, the people journalists, and the public naturally focused on. But according to the people who actually studied the underlying evidence closely enough to make that comparison, it was Kempen's specific operational conduct, not simply Gates's or Ballmer's public statements, that provided some of the most damaging, most directly actionable evidence the government's case actually relied on. There's also a specific, almost darkly comic detail from Kempen's history worth including, because it shows up in the actual news coverage of him at the time and adds a strange human texture to an otherwise purely corporate story. Kempen was convicted of illegally shooting an antelope in Montana in 1998. A genuinely bizarre footnote that period tech press coverage couldn't resist referencing when describing his more consequential corporate sharpshooting against Dell and other OEMs, with one outlet specifically joking about Microsoft's sharpshooter turning his aim on the company's own hardware partners. It's a small, almost throwaway detail in the broader arc of this story, but it's worth including precisely because it's exactly the kind of oddly specific, genuinely verifiable fact that tends to get lost when a historical figure fades from public memory. Kempen wasn't simply an abstract Microsoft executive reducible to a handful of aggressive business memos. He was a real person with a real, occasionally strange life outside the boardroom, one contemporary journalists clearly found irresistible to weave into their coverage of his more consequential corporate behavior, precisely because the parallel between his literal and figurative sharpshooting wrote itself. Kempen ultimately served as a witness defending Microsoft's business practices during the broader 1998 to 2002 antitrust trial, before retiring from the company in 2002. After leaving Microsoft, he didn't simply disappear from public view. He joined several corporate advisory boards, including the National Bureau of Asian Research, and more notably for anyone interested in his own version of these events, wrote a self-published memoir in January 2013 titled Resolve and Fortitude, Microsoft's Secret Power Broker Breaks His Silence. That book received real media attention at the time, and Kempen used the platform it provided to become notably outspoken in the press, offering direct criticism of Microsoft's leadership in the years after his own departure from the company. The fact that Kempen waited over a decade after retiring to publish his own account, and specifically framed it as breaking his silence, suggests he'd spent those intervening years watching others tell his story without his own direct input. The press profiles, the trial coverage, the secret power broker and enforcer framing that followed him throughout his career. And eventually decided he wanted the final word on his own record, on his own terms, rather than leaving. That narrative entirely in the hands of journalists and antitrust lawyers who'd covered him from the outside. It's worth sitting with the fact that Kempen chose that specific title for his own memoir, years after leaving the company. Secret Power Broker, a phrase lifted directly from the press coverage that had followed him during his active years at Microsoft, worn here almost like a badge rather than something he seemed inclined to distance himself from. That's a genuinely interesting choice for someone whose most publicly documented legacy centers on aggressive, deliberately obscured anti-competitive tactics against a rival operating system, suggesting Kempen himself viewed that reputation less as something to apologize for and more as a genuine, if controversial, professional accomplishment worth claiming credit for on his own terms. So why does any of this actually matter now, beyond simply being an interesting historical footnote about a man most people have genuinely never heard of? I think there are two separate, worthwhile reasons to actually sit with Kempen's story, and both connect directly to themes this channel returns to regularly. The first is that Kempen's career is a genuinely useful corrective to the version of Microsoft's anti-Linux history that tends to get told through only its most famous, most quotable moments. Ballmer's cancer comment in 2001, Gates' 1999 dismissal of Linux as no real threat. Those specific quotes get repeated constantly precisely because they're vivid and easy to reference. But the actual sustained day-to-day campaign against Linux adoption wasn't fought primarily through public statements at all. It was fought through exactly the kind of quiet, deliberately obscured pricing pressure and contractual leverage Kempen specifically described in his own memos, applied consistently against OEMs over years, largely outside public view until court proceedings forced those internal documents into daylight. The public quotes are the visible tip of a much larger, much less visible campaign, and Kempen's own memos are some of the clearest surviving evidence of what that larger campaign actually looked like in practice. That distinction matters for how we understand corporate competitive behavior more broadly, not just in this one specific historical case. The quotable, headline-grabbing statements from a company's most visible executives are often deliberately distinct from the actual operational tactics being carried out several levels down the org chart by executives like Kempen, who rarely faced public scrutiny during their active years. precisely because they weren't the ones giving press interviews or testifying at Senate hearings. Understanding Kempen's role means understanding that the real mechanics of a campaign like this one usually live in exactly the kind of unglamorous mid-level operational memos that rarely surface publicly at all, unless a lawsuit specifically forces them into evidence. The second reason connects directly back to a story we've covered on this channel before, and it's worth drawing that connection explicitly. Lenovo's current, quietly offered Linux pricing option on machines like the ThinkPad X1 Carbon represents almost the exact inverse of the entire dynamic Kempen spent years enforcing. Where Kempen's job was pressuring OEMs to avoid making Linux visible, competitively priced, or easy for ordinary customers to actually choose, Lenovo today makes that exact choice directly visible on its own configuration pages, with no apparent pressure from Microsoft to hide or discourage it. That's not a coincidence of history repeating differently. It's a genuine, measurable sign of how much the underlying power dynamic between Microsoft and its OEM partners has actually shifted since Kempen's era, when a single Microsoft executive could credibly threaten to make life difficult for any manufacturer that promoted Linux too visibly, and manufacturers took that threat seriously enough to quietly retreat, the way Dell did in 2001. Whether that shift reflects genuine principle on Microsoft's part, or simply the reality that Microsoft's own business no longer depends on Windows licensing revenue with anywhere near the same intensity it once did, given how much of the company's growth today comes from Azure, a cloud platform that itself depends heavily on Linux running at scale, is a question worth sitting with rather than answering too quickly. But either way, the contrast between Kempen's documented tactics and today's much more open competitive landscape tells you something real and measurable about just how far this specific industry relationship has actually traveled. I want to know if this is a piece of history you'd already heard of before this video, or whether Kempen's name was genuinely new to you. If you lived through this era of the Microsoft antitrust trial as it was actually happening, I'd be especially curious to hear whether Kempen's role registered publicly at the time, or whether he really was as obscure. To ordinary observers then, as his current near-total absence from public memory would suggest, and if you've read his 2013 memoir, I'd genuinely like to know how he framed his own role in his own words, compared to how the court documents and contemporary press coverage framed it from the outside. Tell me in the comments. Stories like this one, about the people who did the actual enforcement work behind more famous public statements, are exactly the kind of history I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. If you want more grounded coverage of the real history behind the Microsoft Linux rivalry, the parts that didn't make it into the famous quotes everyone already knows, subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you in the next video.